Hi, everyone. I'm Robbie Diamond, CEO of the Electrification Coalition and SAFE. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And thanks to the staff at the Electrification Coalition and all of our speakers for joining us. There's been some shifting around due to the hot political environment. But you'll still be hearing from EPA, DOT, and DOE. So I wanted to introduce this and sort of frame it as remembering the days when SAFE was writing its first recommendations to the nation and talking about electric vehicles in 2005. And there was a group of people in California who are rigging their Priuses with plugs against Toyota policy in order to convince Toyota to create a plug-in hybrid. And at that time, even the environmental community was not fully on board, thinking that these would just burn coal and would not be good for the environment. And where we are today, and why it's so exciting to be having this conversation. We're at a point where this is the principal way to reduce emissions in this country and in the world. We're at a place where the automakers are each announcing multi-billion-dollar investments, no longer hiring internal combustion engineers and putting all their emphasis on electric vehicles. These are decisions like moving a tanker. It takes years to make these decisions, and once it's been made, it doesn't seem like it's going back. And today, with the passing of the infrastructure bill, you really feel like the US government is finally all in, not just thinking about credits for cars, but thinking about charging and all other types of vehicles. And hopefully this is just a down payment for the future ahead. So we're really excited here at the Electrification Coalition and SAFE. The Electrification Coalition is committed to direct implementation projects, working with many of you on this call. They work on state, local, and federal policy to both accelerate and ease the electrification shift, and finally creating toolkits and different types of policy reports to provide guidance to the implementers on the ground. And SAFE, the sister organization to the Electrification Coalition, is really trying to make sure that these vehicles and these chargers are built here in the United States and with our allies in order not to create new dependencies on new supply chains. And this family of organizations working together to shift to this world of domestic, diverse, and stable priced fuel sources. So with that, I'm excited to bring to you this presentation on these steps that the government wants to make. First, I want to introduce Ann Blair, our Senior EV Policy Manager, who will provide a little overview of what is in the infrastructure bill. Ann?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Robbie. To kick us off today, I'd like to share a high-level details of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and then we will hear from our speakers at the EPA, Department of Energy, and Department of Transportation. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law has gone by various names as it's made its way through the legislative process. So you may have heard it been referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Deal, HR 3684, or the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA. But now it's affectionately being referred to primarily as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This law is the reauthorization legislation that will guide the federal transportation program through at least 2026. The law passed the Senate in August, the House on November 8th, and was signed into law by President Biden on November 15th. The law includes several new programs that will help support the expansion of electric vehicles across the country. Specifically, it includes $7.5 billion investment to build out the first ever national charging network in the United States. It provides funding for the deployment of EV charging along highway corridors and grant funding specifically that will focus on rural, disadvantaged, and hard to reach communities that need this support the most. So diving in a little bit deeper, the funding will specifically provide grants for charging and fueling infrastructure for corridors and communities. specifically $2.5 billion for alternative fuels. So that includes everything from EVs to compressed natural gas to hydrogen. And it will be deployed over a series of years with $300 million for fiscal year 2022, and then upwards of $100 million for fiscal year 2026. The discretionary grant program will be 50% of the funding will be for designated alternative fuel corridors and 50% funding for communities. Eligible entities include state and local governments, MPOs, transit and port authorities, and tribal communities. There is a 20% match for this program. Then there is the National Electric Vehicle Formula Program, which is $5 billion for EV corridors, and it'll be distributed to states at approximately $1 billion per year for each year between 2022 and 2026. The program will provide support for state and localities for the acquisition and installation, as well as operation and maintenance for the charging stations. Data sharing for the infrastructure will also be supported to ensure long-term success of investments made. And to wrap us up on this, USDOT and USDOE will develop guidance for states and localities no later than 90 days after enactment of the law. So we're looking at around mid-February. And all funding will flow through state DOTs. So that's a brief summary for you today. And just to get us all the same page, we'll hear more from our speakers from DOT shortly. So I'm going to turn it back over to Robbie now to introduce our first speaker from EPA. Robbie?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ann, and thank you for all your hard work bringing these programs on the ground and helping the entire team pass legislation like this. Let me just take a word before I go to Karl Simon. And a word to our sponsors. I want to thank in particular Bloomberg Philanthropies for all their support in allowing an institution like the EC to exist that really wants to work with cities and states to advance electrification and really on that ground. And what we've really discovered is it's not just about big pronouncements that are made of what kind of transition you have, but really working with the people who used to turn the wrench and are now making decisions on what vehicles to buy and where to put the chargers. And these are just vastly different world and a lot of questions being asked, and just providing these toolkits and boot camps for people, we've just found to be, it's just making that first experience good and then that second experience good and growing the fleet one by one. So thank you so much for doing that, and we'll continue to work with you. Let me introduce Karl Simon. Probably does not need an introduction. I've known Karl for years. Thank you, Karl, for doing this. Karl is the Director of the Transportation and Climate Division of the Office of Transportation and Air Quality in the US EPA. His portfolio includes work with voluntary programs like SmartWay, international trade issues, analytical modeling, forecasting mobile sources, emission trends, and future scenarios. He previously served as the Director of the Compliance and Innovative Strategies Division and other roles in the Transportation Office, as well as once being an engineer at Newsport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. You're a long way from there, Karl, these days. Mr. Simon holds a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Notre Dame, a law degree from George Mason University, and a Master's in Environmental Law from George Washington University. But most just see him as the cop on the beat to make sure that the car companies make vehicles zero-emission vehicles. So turning over to you, the top cop, Karl Simon.
Thanks, Robbie. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to come talk to you and your colleagues here at the Electrification Coalition on this issue. And it's not that far away from the shipyard. A submarine's just kind of a more, it's still transportation at the end of the day. It's just a little different purpose transportation source, and one that clearly has a different structure to it. We are to say, I don't think it's an understatement to say we are very excited to be in the space that you and Ann have laid out for us today in terms of being able to be a component of the work that the Congress is giving us across the sectors to look at electrification, and especially in the school bus sector. So as we think about the work that we are going to do under this provision, under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, it is specifically focused in on what's known as the Clean School Bus Program. About half of that money, $5 billion over a course of, I think, 5 or 6 years at the end of the day, goes strictly to electric source, zero emission sources. So electricity and fuel cells would be the operative numbers here. The other half of it is put into a category called clean school buses that involve a number of different technologies, including electric and fuel cells. So we're going to have, I think, an interesting market dynamic when we go to run this program and implement it, and that we'll have 2 separate pools we're going to have to keep track of. But there is some cross-pollination across those 2 pools in terms of zero emission technology. So stay tuned for that. We are, the numbers are a little mind-boggling at times for those of us at EPA, given that our entire budget for the agency on an annual basis is roughly double what this one provision gives us over 5 years. So we're not necessarily used to spending this amount of money in ways that will, in terms of the infrastructure. So we're working hard to set those things up as well too internally, so that we can get the planning out there too. I will put a plug in, and I'll put it in the chat box, Robbie, when we get done here, is that tomorrow we're actually having our first listening sessions, a public engagement, our first kind of big foray into public engagement on this provision. It will be, I think it's a Zoom activity that will allow us to kind of walk through the provisions of the rule in a little more detail, and also to, more importantly, hear from a wide range of stakeholders about certain issues that we should be thinking about in terms of implementation. It will not be the last time by any stretch where we engage interested stakeholders on this provision. We are cognizant of the fact that, and I think Robbie's introduction touched nicely on the transformative nature of just what this piece of that program can look like. It's not just getting, and I say just, and it is important to focus on the fact that we're trying to get as many clean school buses out on the road as possible, because there are direct public health benefits of that, and direct public health benefits to children, which even have greater benefits kind of societal as we go forward. But it's also, there are provisions in here of thinking about those very things that Robbie talked about in terms of where are these buses coming from? How are you sourcing materials? What are you thinking about in terms of batteries, and how that helps develop the market that this country is often running on? We are, if you look at the provisions in the bill, there's a lot of interest on trying to think about engaging with communities that may not have played in this space in the past. So we will be spending a fair amount of time working with stakeholders on developing outreach plans and engagement strategies to help school districts across the country, not just in well-funded or certain urban school districts that have played in the space so far. We're not new to the electric bus game. We've been funding electric buses through our DERA program over the years. But those numbers there will not be impressive in the scale that we're going to be talking about here. It has given us an idea of some of the challenges that we have in front of us as both an organization, but also as we work with our stakeholders across the board in building this market awareness and acceptance, because to spend this amount of funding, it leads to a lot of buses. So we are learning from our process here, but we are not we're not going to be sedentary and saying that we have it all figured out and this is how it's going to be. I would fully expect that the decisions and the implementation structures we put in place in the early years will change over the course of the program, because the market will change. The acceptance, the school districts' approaches will change. the public applicability on addressing the vehicle to grid infrastructure ideas will change. And we want it to change because we want to see that at the end of the day that we have a viable market here because the funding does run out. It is a lot of money, but it does run out. And that's how we're thinking about this. So we want to make sure that we're building lasting structures here as well, too, in those areas where those make sense. You'll hear from, and I think when we have our colleagues from DOE and DOT join us here momentarily, that the work that Ann went through, there's a lot of stuff there that talks about DOE and DOT and building up infrastructure. I can say that we are closely tied into that work with our colleagues over in those two organizations, and we will be relying on them and their technical expertise heavily to help us sort through, especially on the infrastructure side, kind of what makes sense. We can do a little bit of funding under the statutory requirements that we have under bill. The questions that we will get under that will sort themselves out, but we are really looking forward to kind of having a one approach so that we are all kind of moving in the same direction. There's no reason to have an EPA version versus a DOE version versus a DOT version. And I think you're seeing that both in the announcement today that they're going to talk about, but also as we kind of think through this structure together. I don't want to underestimate the challenge we have here too. Again, I think Robbie did a nice job laying out kind of the overview here is that this is a big task. It is a transformative task at the end of the day. But it's not like we're starting from scratch. We have, I think, a good expertise and a good provisions that can build on this. And we look forward to working with everybody in this space to get to the right answers at the end of the day. Just one last thought, Robbie, and then I'll turn it back over to you. And Ann, is that separate and apart from kind of the funding infrastructures that we've talked about here, I will also note that we have an organizational priority of doing rulemaking in the commercial truck space. We have one now at OMB on a near-term rule, and then the president announced in August, and we have on the reg agenda that was just recently released, a rulemaking that looks at heavy-duty greenhouse gas phase 3, I guess would be a colloquial way to put it. So basically, our next version of that rulemaking. Clearly, the discussions that you all are working for will be relevant to that and how we implement the work under the bill. And if Build Back Better, what comes up with that, there's some provisions in there that could be really interesting and helpful. All of this stuff will be relevant here because it is not just one action solves everybody's issues. It will be not just a whole of government, but a whole of stakeholders. And there's a lot of moving pieces in the space. So we're, again, I think looking at these things kind of broadly and holistically as well to kind of tell that story. So Robbie, let me turn it back to you and Ann. And I saw there were a couple of questions, but we can do what I know we're making the agenda up as we go along here a bit, given our friends. I'm kidding. We're good.
We never make things up over here. Never. Okay, Karl, let me ask you a couple quick questions, and then there'll be rolling questions throughout. My first question is about, the VW settlement that you are all very part of. How is that, I guess, fed into some of the lessons learned? Do you have any thoughts on that? And maybe some of the previous things you've done on buses. Is there maybe one or two things you think you're doing based on what you've learned?
I think we've seen from the VW, so generally we don't have a lot of insight into how the states have been funding that monies, but we have seen that there is I think almost all of the states, when we looked across kind of what people adopted, one of the options for funding was EV infrastructure. And I think almost all of them picked it. Not everybody, but a good chunk of states said, yes, we want to devote, I think it was up to 15% on that question. So I think the lesson learned from that is there is a strong desire across the country, not just in certain states, to think about this issue because they see it coming. The one consistent bit of feedback we've had, both from that and from the funding streams and opportunities we've done through DERA, is that there is also a pretty dramatic lack of good information out there for people to make those good investment decisions. So trying to get information to state and local government officials that maybe aren't as familiar with this issue as people on this call are. What kind of information helps those decision makers make the right choice here, as opposed to what they're hearing from marketing, for example.
Okay, there's been a couple questions about vehicle to grid. School buses have seen this, it's like sort of a perfect application for the vehicle to also help power the grid in the summer when you need the load. How are you factoring that into decision making?
We're certainly looking at it. I mean, it's clear that that's something that the Congress wants us to pay attention to, and we're trying to figure out how best to structure that into this stream or into what DOE and DOT are going to do. But it clearly will be a factor as we go forward. I don't know. We're kind of early days in our planning, so nothing there. But just we're kind of information gathering, trying to think through, and we know there's some good models out there that we can learn from, and we'll take that and then figure out what we can do otherwise.
Okay, great. I have one more quick question, and then we'll come back to you for other questions, which is what's your timing, do you think, until the money starts coming out the door? And what is your phone number so people can call to get the money?
555-555-5555.
Wow, it's amazing that you're able to snag that number.
I have this one. I think there's a Seinfeld episode of this, going back. We will be standing up. I think if it's not already up by tomorrow, we'll have a website set up for this specific question in terms of, and I would ask and I'll have people focus on that because that'll be the best way to contact us for discussions, information. We're going to try to keep that as current as we move along. Your first part of your question sounds like something I get every week is when are we going to start to see this? And the answer is as fast as we can. Standing this up is not as I said, we actually don't even have a budget for this yet. We're still going through the internal structure with our colleagues across the government because we can't actually spend any money yet because it just got signed fairly recently. So there is a dance that we have to do there. But we are looking to get things moving early to mid next year, and it'll be kind of probably a rolling structure. So the provisions allow for funding in a couple of different pools. We're trying to get at least some money moving as fast as we can because we recognize that the clock is ticking.
Okay, great. Thank you, Karl. Let me introduce Catherine Stankin, who is our Senior Director of EV Policy, to share some brief words before we turn to the DOT.
Yep, thanks, Robbie, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to run through a quick couple slides that show some of the resources that the Electrification Coalition has available to help us meet our EV moment. So first off, today we are excited to release the State Plug-in Adoption Resource Kit, or SPARK, which is an online database of resources to help fleet managers and other state government officials incorporate EVs into their fleets. And the tool also features a step-by-step guide to state fleet electrification. So resources in this searchable database include real-life examples of fleet transition goals, policy guidance, case studies, legislation, technical support documents, and tools. And each step in the 8-step guide features a set of recommended related resources from this database. And so you can find SPARK on the EC website at electrificationcoalition.org/SPARK. And the next tool here that was going to help all of you take advantage of the federal funding that our next speaker will talk about is on the EC website. It's called the EV Laws and Incentives Database. And here you can find more information on the federal, state laws and incentives for EVs, charging stations, air quality, fuel efficiency, and other transportation-related topics. And this tool pulls from the U.S. Department of Energy's Alternative Fuels Data Center, and you can filter this tool to look at some of those laws and incentives available. The third tool that we have is a new webpage that provides guidance to local governments for obtaining federal funding for electrification projects. And this is a great new website for any local government that are potentially interested in seeking federal funding for electrification projects. So I encourage you to check this out, and it'll be updated on a regular basis. And this page looks at a number of the resources that will help you plan your project from start to finish and prepare your application for federal funding. There are some great project proposal checklists that our deployment team has put together based on dozens of projects that they provided technical support to from around the country. And even if you're not a local government organization, there's a lot of good information there that could be useful for fleets of all different sizes, whether it's a public fleet or a private sector fleet. And finally, one more tool that I'd like to share with you is our dashboard for rapid vehicle electrification, also known as the Drive tool. And you can see the link there to access the Drive tool. And this was developed by the Electrification Coalition to provide quick and easy analysis for light, medium, and heavy-duty fleet electrification. And the way this tool works is that users quickly just upload their fleet data into this easy-to-use tool that will calculate the total cost of ownership and emissions for your existing conventional vehicles and provides comparison data for the comparable electric vehicles that are on the market. And the tool analyzes and assesses the best fits for EV deployment within minutes. It is run off of the Excel platform, so it's something that most people are familiar with using. And the tool will then give you the exact list of electric vehicles that then you can use to replace your gas vehicles with. And this tool works for both public fleets and also for private sector fleets, whether it's small fleet, large fleets, whichever. You just need to put in the VIN numbers for the fleets. And with that, here's also one more slide showing what the tool provides. And again, it's really easy to use. It's a free resource there, and it's available at our website. And with that, I will turn it back to Robbie, who will then introduce our next speaker from the Department of Transportation.
Before I do that, I'm excited to announce for just a low price of $19.99, you can get all 5 tools if you order today. So go to electrificationcoalition.org and please use the tools. We've been doing this for 10 years, and we've really amassed a lot of information on the ground, part of the Smart City Challenge in the past, and just with fleets around the country. So please, we look forward to working with you to deploy this money well. Okay, let me introduce Kelsey Owens, who is the Environmental Protection Specialist for USDOT, the Office of the Secretary at the USDOT, and the Office of Policy, where she develops policy and guidance for all types of projects, including electrification. Kelsey has an MPA and a Master's of Sciences in Environmental Science from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs from Indiana University. Most importantly, she's got 3 horses and 3 dogs. And so thank you so much, Kelsey, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. I'm so excited to be here. Andrew Wishnia, our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy, apologizes very much for not being here, and I will explain why he's not here in just a moment. So just wanted to run through a few of the variety of responsibilities that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law gives to DOT, and we really have some incredible opportunities to electrify transportation through this law. We have up to $5.25 billion for transit electrification, $2.25 billion for port resilience and electrification, and as Ann mentioned earlier, $7.5 billion for funding for EV charging infrastructure. And this includes $5 billion in formula funding at federal highways for states to acquire, install, operate, and maintain chargers with the goal of building out a national EV network, and then $2.5 billion in grant funding. That's discretionary grant funding for community-based charging and to build out our alternative fuel corridors. So DOT, in collaboration with Department of Energy, is also required to develop guidance and standards documents by the infrastructure law. We have a very brief 90 days to develop guidance that will help states and cities to strategically, here we go, deploy EV charging stations to build out a national network. And then we have a slightly longer 180 days to develop minimum standards for EV charging stations. The statute does set out some requirements that funded EV chargers must follow. They have to be non-proprietary and must meet applicable industry safety standards, and they have to have open access to payment methods that are available to all members of the public, not just subscribers. And then through the 180-day standard document, we also need to develop standards related to, amongst other things, installation, operation, and maintenance of qualified technicians, the interoperability of EV charging infrastructure, traffic control devices, network connectivity of EV chargers, and information on publicly available EV charger locations, pricing, availability, and accessibility through mapping locations. We are also required to redesignate our alternative fuel corridors within 180 days. And then we have 1 year to designate national EV corridors for freight and goods movement along major national highways, the National Highway Freight Network, and then locations like ports and intermodal centers. We also, through the infrastructure bill, have a brand new office that is the reason why Andrew Wishnia is unable to join today. Secretaries Buttigieg and Granholm are currently, I think maybe as we speak, if it's not already signed, signing a memorandum of understanding between Department of Transportation and Energy on the operation of a joint office of energy and transportation, which both agencies will co-implement together. This office will be dedicated to expanding and providing access to EV chargers, as well as implementing investments in zero emission vehicles, transit, active transportation, climate resilience, and other topics that are of mutual interest to both departments, so that Americans can have transportation options that are safe, clean, equitable, and affordable. So some more specific areas that the office must focus on include providing technical assistance related to EV infrastructure, sharing EV infrastructure operation data, performance of a national EV charging network, development and deployment of training and certification programs, and development of a utility accommodations policy for high and medium voltage transmission in our transportation right-of-ways. So in early December, we issued a request for information seeking stakeholder feedback and information on the proposed EV charging network and guidance, including how we can make this network equitable, which is very important to the administration and to DOT. We'll be accepting comments for 60 days. I highly recommend that anyone that's interested in this meeting submit comments. We're very, very interested in getting as many comments as we can. We want to make this network the best it can possibly be. And lastly, of all of that information I've just thrown at you, in the next few months, we're really excited. We'll be issuing a rural EV toolkit that will be aimed at helping to lead rural communities through the process of funding and citing consideration for EV charging stations. So you'll definitely want to look for that. We're really excited for that one. So I know I just threw a ton of information at you guys. Happy to answer any questions either now or through email at a later time. So thank you so much for having me.
Hi, let me ask you this. Is there any particular area you would like for people to opine in the RFI? And secondly, is the RFI really the only way to provide information, or do you have recommendations or other opportunities coming forward that they should know about?
We are happy to take comments on anything related to the EV network or program implementation. The RFI has a little bit more information about the particular areas that we're especially interested in. As I mentioned, equity is one of our big concerns, and we're very interested from hearing from the public and from stakeholders about how we can make sure that that is done correctly. And then we have been having that White House and DOE together have been having stakeholder engagement meetings throughout the course of about the last month. But we're always interested in any emails, any way that you would like to get in touch with us. But the RFI is really kind of the best option at this point. We can make sure that everyone can access the open docket, and then we can have a holistic review of all of the comments we receive as we move forward.
there's a question about the difference between the alternative fuel corridor and the national EV corridors. Do you have any explanation for that for our audience?
Yeah, the alternative fuel corridors include not only electric vehicles, it also includes methane and natural gas and hydrogen and some other options. So not only limited to electric. Then the requirement for the freight EV network will literally just be electric. So that is a difference between the two.
That's great. I think we have Michael Berube here from DOE. So Kelsey, we'll come back to you in a moment. But I see that Michael is on site somewhere.
And to the members of the Electrification Coalition, if you can hear me okay, hopefully.
We decided to go all in, get the live shot.
We are here. I'm up here actually in Tacoma Park. This is actually the only gas station that we know of that is converted 100% to a EV charging station. And Secretary Granholm, Secretary Buttigieg just pulled out minutes ago after announcing the new joint office of energy and transportation between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy. So very exciting morning for sure. It's kind of one of the first real significant moves and announcements actually on different parts of the infrastructure bill across both agencies. So also a great precedent.
Well, that's great. I'm sorry that they left you behind. Were you running after the motorcades?
I got my EV here. I just need to get a little charge before I left.
That's perfect. So can you just maybe, well, I guess I should introduce you first for people who don't know. And I don't know if I got so excited to see you on the screen like that. I left my notes behind. But Michael is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sustainable Transportation in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And in this role, he oversees ERE's sustainable transportation sector, which includes vehicles, hydrogen, fuel cells, bioenergy technologies, and everything else. This portfolio focuses on research development to increase the use of domestic clean transportation fuels. And so he comes from the auto industry originally. And so it's just wonderful to have been working with you for all these years, Michael. Please just tell us what's your vision for what's going to happen coming out of DOE, and how could all these state, city, fleet people listening in take advantage of this new opportunity?
Thanks, Robbie, and thanks for having me here. First, let me just say that a few points. We at DOE and at DOT together are really committed to working together in a whole of government approach. And that goes beyond the federal government, but to state and local governments as well. Through the infrastructure bill, there's clearly tremendous amounts of investment dollars being put out in electrification, including both battery electrification and hydrogen, to achieve the goals that we have, which is really nothing short of complete transportation decarbonization. How do we decarbonize all of the transportation sector is going to take a partnership between federal government and states and local communities. So just know that up front. We certainly don't have all the answers, but we also have a lot of resources that we want to bring to bear. One of the things that you'll be hearing about as more is talked about on the National EV Charging Program is technical assistance that we will be getting going out of this joint office and out of both agencies to help work with states to bring some of the tools that we have at the national labs, for example, who have done work with a number of states, but to bring that capability to all the states to help them understand or help them analyze what's best in their state, what their needs are. We know that each state and really community knows their community, know their state the best. So you can't supplant that knowledge, but can we help bring some tools and maybe some expertise, lessons learned from other states to help them as they develop their plan. But I will say also that I think collectively we have to keep in mind that the goal is to develop a true national system, a national system for charging. So that has to work for people when they're near their home, has to work for people when they're working, and has to work for people when they're traveling. So coordination regionally and across states, and having a national feel will also be critically important. I will also, just to point out, maybe beyond EV charging, as you think about, states and communities, Robbie, you mentioned hydrogen. There's a very significant provision in the infrastructure bill also on building out hydrogen hubs across the country to really demonstrate how do we both produce clean hydrogen, use it locally. We all believe that this is another key part for, heavy duty transportation, but also for working with the grid to help make the grid work and renewables. So those regional hubs, we think, can be a first step in helping to kind of prove that out, look at where that capability can be. And I'll just, for those of you that don't know, point out, we set a new goal earlier this year, announced by the secretary, to achieve $1 a kilogram cost for hydrogen, which is really a game changer. That opens up more segments beyond transportation, we believe, for use of hydrogen overall. So let me pause there, Robbie, and kind of let you get some questions in.
Okay. I guess my first question, there's been a lot of chatter on our chats about, the private sector versus just grants for the public sector, creating something that ultimately not business sustainable. How do you, and in all your studies and also just in your conception of how to use the money, do you perceive that working together to make sure we don't end up with something that might sound great but is not sustainable from a business perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is absolutely critical in every one of the different programs, whether it be the EV charging network, battery and cell manufacturing, processing, which is also significant direction in the bill, or hydrogen. So what we are going to be doing is in every one of these programs, viability is directly a key part of the objective. And, we're bringing federal dollars into these because there are places where they're not completely viable yet, obviously, right? They're purely on private sector dollars. They need some assistance, or they're high risk. But that doesn't mean we're not looking at the longer term viability. So for EV charging as well, maybe currently there's not quite enough traffic there, but we know that the volume's going up a lot, and can we help accelerate that? Or in some communities, rural, underserved communities as well, where again there isn't quite enough volume or business model yet, can federal government help accelerate some of that? But we will absolutely be thinking and looking towards long-term viability in the program designs across these, as well as in the actual specific projects.
Is it fair to say that this bill, which of course has a companion that might pass called Build Back Better, this one's more geared to that grant type of investing in these places that might not otherwise get the investment, and the next bill, which we might talk about soon, is more geared for that private sector to make those business decisions?
I'm not sure. Not sure if that quite breaks down that way. Okay. And of course, the Build Back Better is still kind of an active discussion, negotiation. So don't want to go there. I will say though that the current programs, if you look at the National EV Charging Program that Kelsey probably was just talking about, there's a grant component of that, $5 billion formula grants, and then there's a competitive grants portion of it. That's not formula driven. That's $2.5 billion. So there is a mix of those both in there. I will say one thing that's common when I look across all the different programs that we are, looking at from the infrastructure bill across DOE is having a strong link to the communities, having a strong link to workers in those. So obviously, when you're doing very, very large programs, you're going to have a lot of commercial entities, companies, big companies as well. But we don't want to make sure that the individual person, the local communities where these projects will live, are not lost or not forgotten, and that they're part of the discussions up front in the early parts.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, until I turn it over to Ann Blair and Alex Hutkin, who is Director of Government Relations for the SAFE team. So you'll have the duo of SAFE and the EC. But my last question is on a slightly different topic, because someone did ask about supply chains, and you are a supply chain expert on batteries. There was $6 billion, the first time that we put this money to processing of minerals in the United States. So maybe just speak briefly about supply chains. And, we just heard Karl talking about $2.5 billion in buses. will the buses be available? Will the batteries be in the United States? What is your view on that? And how do some of those players participate?
We need them to be, and the goal of those funds is to help seed that, to help bring that to bear. There are also, Buy America provisions across the law as well that we'll look at, but we know that, you can't buy what's not there, right? So we need to develop the processing capability. When we've looked at the entire supply chain, processing is the linchpin, we think. Cell manufacturing, we think we can grow here in the US and need to, but it'll be a lot easier if you have processing here. And if you don't have the processing, you just have a critical weakness in your supply chain. It maybe won't be that 100% of processing can happen in the US, but we think we can get a substantial portion of that across the range of battery items. So part of that is looking at extraction as well, and where you can sustainably extract as well, and where we have resources, which we do have some resources on specific critical materials here in the US. So the purpose of those goals, those grants really, as the law says, is to develop that processing portion of the supply chain across all its different aspects to then feed into the cell manufacturing, which was again another part of the infrastructure bill. So hopefully those two programs will work together collectively to help build out that supply chain.
That's great. As we like to say, we need to have a strategy that goes from minerals all the way to the final market. And that's what we have here today. We're talking about that final market and the minerals and the processing and the cells that we'll need to get there. So excellent. So let's
can I add one thing, Rob, because you opened the door there. Sorry.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to. I'm slamming it shut, man.
Yeah, recycling. Recycling is in our mind a critical part, and there are a number of provisions. There's probably close to $1 billion in different provisions, I believe, on the recycling side, and it brings it full circle, right? Because we think that we can have a significant portion of our future materials, especially in certain ones like cobalt, where existing batteries, especially in electronics, very high cobalt. Future batteries will be much lower. We believe we can get a recycling business going in the US and are going to be working aggressively towards that. And that also helps address some of that, because you don't need to reprocess those as well. Never mind extracting.
I mean, what's so amazing about the batteries is once you have the minerals in your country, unlike oil that you burn, that we've had this bane of our existence all the time having to go get, you have all those minerals if we just recycle them and keep them here. So we need to make sure we're not exporting those batteries, but keeping them here, continuing to use those minerals. And I just say that I do want to remind people that you do need to build a battery once before you can recycle it. And this is massive. These are hundreds of millions of new materials. So one last thing for Karl, who's listening in, I can see him there. We've been talking more and more in our organization about rethinking the label for the car, and how do you put human rights and environmental standards from those minerals, from the provenance, all the way to the final market. If we can have a race to the top instead of just competing on price, and create transparency through blockchain and other technologies, we think that's where you get that supply chain based on our values, a race to the top, and the recycling in the end. So we're excited to come to you in the new year with some of these ideas in your office. Okay, let me turn it over now to Alex and Ann, who can ask them. They both worked on these bills, and I'm sure they have very specific questions. Thank you both for your hard work, and please have at it, DOE, DOT, and EPA.
Thank you so much, Robbie. I'll let Alex kick us off.
Sounds great. Thanks, Ann, and thank you all for being here with us today. This is a really exciting opportunity for both the SAFE and EC team to have gotten the infrastructure bill over the finish line. Hopefully, it's a great down payment. Hopefully, we can also get Build Back Better over the finish line this year as well. I know that's not the point of today's conversation, but did want to make sure that I do point that out, that we do need Build Back Better to really capitalize on the investments made in the infrastructure bill. With the announcement today of the new joint office, really curious to understand how lessons learned as well as best practices from EPA will be included in the thinking of this new office. Given EPA's long history of administering programs like DERA and CMAQ. So curious to know how those lessons and also history of work be included into this new joint office?
I'll start out, and then I'm going to ask my colleague Karl there. So one of the ways is that Karl and I probably talk about it every 2 or 3 days, as well as with Kelsey and our other counterparts. And not just now, we've been working together for a number of years. One of the things, though, specifically that we can do is bring together our teams where we have expertise maybe in a national lab or in DOE in doing one specific item, like working with utilities, and can we help then Karl and the EPA with their program, and then vice versa, as they've had experience, how can they help here? But with that, I'll pass over for Karl and Kelsey for added comments.
Yeah, no, I think Michael hit it on the spot, is that we all have our when you look at the end goal here, we all have our strengths here, and we're trying to reach out in areas where that works. We are not going to be spending our time developing a national electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We've already relied on NREL's great work and the work that Michael and his team are doing, and the joint office will do, and we'll fit into that spot. So I really think it is and I think we have a great model for collaboration, cooperation, and understanding of what each of us are trying to do under our various authorities, and just really building on that and being laser focused on making sure that we're doing what we need to do and we're not doing things we don't need to be doing, and vice versa.
Great. Thanks so much for those comments, Karl. And I also, Michael, back to you. I wanted to just comment that, EC has had a long history of doing some technical assistance through the Smart City Challenge and other programs. And we're excited to support the workplace charging efforts in partnership with Fourth, organization out of the Northwest, on the recent funding opportunity and announcement there. So looking forward to that. Just to follow up a little bit, there were some questions from the audience specifically on the role of Department of Energy versus the joint office, and how you're ultimately going to handle reviewing of applications. And is there any specific guidance that you would provide to cities and states as they begin to prepare to submit projects for consideration?
First I would say the idea, the vision behind the joint office is truly to be joint. So not a DOE office, not a DOT office, it's a joint office. And that office, will be staffed up. They will be providing a lot of not only the technical assistance outward facing, but technical assistance internally, to whether it's to DOT or DOE. Ultimately, the law does provide, for in the case of the National EV Corridor Program, right, for Federal Highways Administration to be administering and making those grants. And so just to be clear, they will be doing that. The joint office role is going to be to help with all the things beforehand, help with technical assistance, and then help as Federal Highways is reviewing those types of proposals. So I guess one thing I would give advice to states is, we look back to the VW funds broadly, a lot of, and how that was implemented. When I look at states where their Department of Energy and Department of Transportation were working collectively, I think you had really a lot of power there. So I would certainly encourage states, do a little of what we're doing if you aren't already. Make sure your state DOE, your state energy office, as well as your state transportation office are working together and are thinking holistically. This is an all new type of program. This is not something that any of us have ever done before anywhere near this scale. It's not a typical grant program or other pieces. So there's going to be some new things there. I just encourage people, don't necessarily just think about it the way you've always done. Take a fresh approach, and do as we come out with that technical assistance support through the joint office, please take advantage of that.
If I could add just a few words on that, absolutely echo what Michael said, and then just to encourage everyone to look at the 90-day guidance that will be coming out. It'll have some really useful information on helping to prepare for those applications. And then, once we especially have modes of contact for the joint office, please feel free to reach out to us, especially early in the planning process, if you have any questions or need any technical assistance.
Thank you both for that. That was very, very helpful. Maybe this might be a question for Kelsey, but curious about how the department is balancing the need to get infrastructure deployed, but is also considering how do we make sure that it's future-proof. There are some questions in the from the audience about vehicle-to-grid integration, making sure that as we're deploying new infrastructure that it has these capabilities. So how is the department balancing the need to get infrastructure out there, but also including technologies like vehicle-to-grid that our charging infrastructure that we're building now is still relevant and useful 10 years from today?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think at this point, we're still most definitely getting stakeholder feedback and input and really looking at what the public and what companies are saying and what their concerns are and what their hopes are. And then exactly looking at how we can balance the existing market with the market to come, recognizing that 500,000 new chargers is a massive shift in the market. And then also looking at the wide variety of locations and types of situations we can have with our EV chargers, ranging from extremely rural areas to very dense urban areas. And all of that will be considered as we move forward with the guidance and then the standards document coming a little later.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelsey. Another question for you, just following up on the RFPs that you have out. Are there specific items that you think folks should focus on first in terms of submitting information, or any specific additional guidance that you could provide to folks responding to the RFI?
Yeah. So the RFI does list a variety of specific topics, but one of the things that again I think we would just love to get as much stakeholder feedback and public feedback from is on equity, how we balance locations and equity, and again looking at rural and urban and disadvantaged communities, and needing to make sure that this is a truly equitable nationwide network. So we would most certainly request specific feedback on those topics, and then any other specific concerns to your specific needs or your company's specific needs, and then opportunities that you see for us to really hit some home runs on this.
One thing I'll add to that excellent comments, Kelsey, is think specifically. That we welcome and are getting lots of good input on the corridor program, which is critical. But also, what are the needs in and around communities? How do we address people who don't have charging at home, multi-unit dwelling, workplace charging? Again, all of those, because there are in the overall program, in addition to the corridor program, there's also a grant program that's a little more community charging based.
And I would support that. I think we're certainly hearing the same thing as well too. So anything we can do in that space to improve that position would be greatly useful.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for those responses. We really appreciate your time, and I just want to remind everyone of the tools and resources that we shared a little earlier. They're excellent to help cities and states get started and utilizing much of this funding. And I know, we've really appreciated working with the staff at both DOT and DOE and EPA on these programs, and they've been really open to accepting comments. So encourage everybody to reach out to the staff on that. Do any of you have any closing comments that you'd like to make before we turn it back over to Robbie?
I'll throw in just two comments. First, thank you guys for your work. You mentioned at the beginning with the workplace charging program. I think that will be critically important. It will be critically important to the grid in particular to have that type of charging during the day. And then just a fun side note, many of you may apply familiar with our Clean Cities coalitions. The station I'm at here, the person who runs it, nice couple, their daughter is currently an intern with Clean Cities Coalition, kind of came up and introduced herself to Secretary Grant Owen Buttigieg, which was just, I thought, such a nice full circle. We need lots of young folks kind of getting involved in this space. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity as well, and look forward to seeing how we can work together to grow this really interesting space.
Absolutely. And to echo Karl and Michael, thank you very much for your support in this space. We're really excited of what the future is going to hold for electric transportation. And then also just to encourage everyone to submit comments. We're really interested in getting as much feedback as we can. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to, I want to end somewhat on time. I'm not going to hold all of you up, but I want to offer, first of all, an incredibly big thanks to our speakers. It's hard to find time in the middle of the day. I thank Michael for working out his arms so he could hold his phone out there for all this time in particular, and for bringing some field shots to the festivities. I do want to, as you heard from Ann, remind you all, we would love to partner with you. You've seen our toolkits. We've worked with fleets. We've worked with governments. We've helped with a fleet transition. We've helped with figuring out where charging should go. Anything, we are here to help. And also we have worked and partnered on supporting grants and gotten grants for transit buses and others. So we're here to help you, as I say, have that first good experience, second one, third one, and finally transition 100% of your fleet. So with that, once again, everyone have a good day. It feels like this has been 18 years in coming at SAFE in the Electrification Coalition, and we're excited to roll up our sleeves and work with all of you. Bye.